Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I am joined by the amazing Loren Ruster, who is a responsible AI researcher. Welcome to the podcast, Loren.
Hi, Zena. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to chat to you, and I'm excited you were able to make the time because I know how insanely busy you are. You're at the tail end of your PhD, which is such a tough place to be. I've been there. I know, I know how hard it is.
Yes, it's definitely, tail end is a good way of putting it. You're at the tail end, but you're not exactly sure how long the tail end is going to be. But it's great to have an opportunity to talk about the research with your audiences, because that's what we're here to do eventually, is to, make sure it makes an impact in the real world. So it's a great
Yeah,
opportunity.
the joys of academia is trying to make your work have an impact in the real world. And one of the hardest parts about that, I think, is trying to communicate what you're trying to do. Because when you're doing a PhD or you're doing research in general, it's like, that scene in a movie where the crazy person has all of the pictures on a wall with the pins and the red lines that all connect. And you're that person and you're trying to show people and be like, this is how it all comes together and connects. And
Yes,
it does
yes,
connect.
yes, 100%. Yeah.
So, with your research in particular, you look at dignity and technology, and you look at putting dignity at the center of technology. Can you explain to me what it means to have dignity at the center of technology?
Yes, so it's been such a fascinating journey. So I've been really interested in the role of dignity and its intersection with how we think about creating, building, deploying, governing AI systems. And how that's really played out in my research is, initially I looked at a bunch of different models of dignity, and one of them, not within the AI space, just generally, one of them that really resonated with me had actually come from international conflict resolution from Dr. Donna Hicks, who's at the Harvard Center for International Conflict Resolution. And she had this sort of 10 elements of dignity. And those 10 elements are things like acceptance of identity, recognition, acknowledgement, inclusion, giving the benefit of the doubt, understanding and accountability, these sorts of things. And she was looking at that in the context of how it plays out in an international conflict where people are at the table, there are solutions that can be found. But without that deeper recognition of each other's dignity, you just can't get to that next stage
Mm.
of operational finding solutions. So this was really the starting point for some of my research was, well, there's a lot of discussion about dehumanization associated with algorithms that are being created or AI systems that are being implemented. And when we think about some of the antithesis of what, dehumanization looks at, some people would say that the other side of that would be to really focus on something that is inherently human, which is dignity. And so with all of that's been going on with, here are all the principles that are important to keep at the forefront of building AI systems, the question to me really came to, okay, well, yes, we can focus on accuracy or transparency or explainability or some of these other principles that get talked about a lot. But what would it look like if we were really focused in on dignity? And so from that question, I have essentially built with, and it's engaged research. So this sort of idea of having impact as you go is really at the forefront of my research. I've been working with several organizations who are really interested in what dignity looks like. That is core to their mission, core to their organizational values anyway. And now they're building AI systems, or they're using data science to build different algorithms. And they're really asking these questions of, well, this is something that's important to us. We don't want to build something that's actually going to violate dignity and violate our organizational values in the process. What do we actually do? No one's forcing them to do it. They're not these super high risk systems according to the EU AI Act, for example, like they're pretty low risk systems. But at the end of the day, they want to be responsible about the products that they're putting out in the world. And so together we've been building on Donna Hicks's model. It's expanded out from those initial thoughts that she had into sort of 6 different ways of thinking about dignity, and then a framework for people to really think through that as they're building technological products.
So, then the way you were describing dignity just there reminded me really of the principles of basic human rights. So, what's the difference between basic human rights and dignity, or are they one and the same, or what's that delineation there?
It's really interesting. So a lot of when we look at, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, dignity comes up as one of the sort of foundational pillars of those human rights. It's in, one of the first couple of articles of that. Um, the challenge with a lot of these human rights based approaches is that they stay at the level of principles. And I suppose the human rights interpretation of what dignity is one particular interpretation. So I've expanded out from just that one interpretation of dignity to kind of look at different disciplines and different ways of thinking about dignity. So that human rights based view of dignity is what I would call sort of foundational dignity, or Menschenwürde is like the German word for it. It's like there's an intrinsic dignity of every human, and that is unique to humans. And it's something that you can't give, you can't take it away. It's uniquely yours. At the same time, it can be violated or influenced by things like technology. So there's sort of this duality to it. You have it, you can't give it, you can't take it away, but it can be impacted in positive and negative ways. And that's usually what people's understanding of dignity is sort of like this sort of universal thing that we all have. But when you look into the literature a lot more, there are lots of other ways of thinking about dignity. So, for example, these are kind of the six that I've distilled. So there's foundational dignity, which is very aligned with the human rights-based
Hmm.
views. And connected to that is this idea of dignity of choice. So, which, is often referred to as autonomy, but this ability to choose, to take risks, to be able to have some stewardship over your own destiny. And when we think about that in the context of algorithms where you're being categorized without your knowing, you're being, put into a place of a deterministic sort of view, yes, you are often stripped of your dignity of choice. And so this comes into play when we're thinking about designing these systems. How might you change people's ability to choose as they're experiencing your system? Then I talk about sort of dignity as experience, which is very connected to sort of Donna Hicks's view. So this desire to really be seen, heard, listened to, understood, recognized in the world, and being given the benefit of the doubt. So that's slightly different from a human rights-based view, because it's not like you just have it. It's also like a feeling or an experience when you're interacting with a person or with a system. And then the fourth one is more non-Western view of what dignity looks like, which is very rooted in ideas like Ubuntu or other ideas where there's this notion that your individual dignity is highly dependent on a communal dignity. So this is this idea of dignity as a communal responsibility. You can only really be in your dignity in relation to others, and this sort of collective idea of others being
I
really
think that's the
important.
one that resonates with me the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last two are ones that come up a lot, but not so much in the AI space. So around environmental dignity. So this is very important in sort of the sustainable development goal sort of world where we talk about, everyone has the right or the dignity to actually live in a world that they can, flourish in. And particularly when we think about the environmental impact that some of these systems are having on they're using a lot of environmental resources. This is a whole other angle of, well, to what extent are we upholding, broader environmental dignity by putting these products in the world that are using certain environmental resources, and how much we're taking that into account. And then the final one is really the dignity of work, which comes up a lot in the context of automation and other things where, there's these ideas that you're going to replace whole workforces or
AI agents.
diminish AI agents, all these things. And so this recognition that, an AI system impacts a user, but it can also impact a whole workforce as you're trying to change the nature of how things operate in an organizational context, or what work really means or can do, and that there's a dignity associated with people having meaning in their work, and how these AI systems potentially impacting that. And it can be in good and bad ways. Like it's not just always a negative conversation. And I think
Mm.
that's the other piece of this whole dignity lens is that, we talk a lot about these principles as being things that are there to help protect you from harms. And whilst that is really important, that for me is only part of the equation. So for me, there's sort of these dual purpose of thinking about dignity. One is, yes, we want to protect people from dignity violations, but the other part of it is we want to actually promote, amplify, enhance the dignity of people, when they're interacting with systems or when they're using them in their jobs or whatever it might be. So it's not just the responsibility is not just about ensuring that the system doesn't make things worse. I mean, it's a good starting point, like let's start there for sure.
Let's
But
start with
there's,
making sure it's not shit.
yeah, let's start with making sure it doesn't kill people and it doesn't like fundamentally harm people. Like that is necessary. But at the end of the day, if you're thinking about, well, do we even need a system? Ultimately, you want to be going from, well, yes, this is also going to enhance, promote, validate, reinforce people's dignity. And those two things, I think, need to coexist in this sort of responsibility conversation, particularly when you're working with entrepreneurs, which is the main sorts of organizations I'm working with, where they have big aspirations. They don't want to be just constrained to a negative conversation when it comes to being responsible about AI, and really reframing this as, yes, we definitely don't want those things. We definitely want to think about the risks, and we want to also think about how we can make it as amazing, as wonderful as possible within the remits of whatever the boundaries are of the product itself.
So you mentioned entrepreneurs, and I know that you've spoken about dignity being the opposite of poverty, and that entrepreneurship is one way of honoring that dignity. Can you unpack
Mm.
that for me a little bit more? Because dignity and entrepreneurship are not two things that I would have put together.
Well, I think actually this comment has come from, so part of the reason why I've ended up working on this particular intersection, which was one piece of the puzzle was back in 2015, 2016, I was a fellow with Acumen, a global fellow with Acumen, which is an impact investor. And that essentially they take philanthropic money in and they invest it as venture capital in social entrepreneurs and
Hmm.
social entrepreneurship organizations all over the world. And the concept of dignity in that context was really emphasized in that organization. So I worked with them for a year. I was inserted into an organization that they had recently invested in, which was a solar energy company in Uganda. And the whole impetus for how they were investing was really based on this idea that entrepreneurship is one way of honoring people's dignity. And I suppose when we come back to these sort of six different ways of thinking about dignity, for them, that dignity that they're talking about is partly foundational, that everyone has dignity, but it's also a lot about dignity of choice. That by investing in entrepreneurs, you are increasing the amount of choices they have to really build their businesses and build their livelihoods and take control of their own agency and their own futures. And that conversation that we had over the course of that year, we had a lot of very in-depth conversations about what investing in sort of impact investing really means. Really was one piece of the puzzle about dignity being really important. And then the other pieces of the puzzle were kind of being really embedded in entrepreneurial environments and just not really seeing these types of conversations playing out. And so I suppose over time, at the end of 2016, 17, 18, I just sort of had this feeling like, wow, what could happen if we brought these two types of communities together? One that's thinking about investing and being a steward for dignity through their decision making on the one hand, and one that's, really alive and energized by the future of technology and the potential of technology, and potentially not so engaged with the responsibility of technology. But, these two together could be a really interesting mix. And in a way, that's kind of what my PhD is doing, is bringing these two worlds together.
So then, speaking of bringing two worlds together, so you're talking a little bit about the kind of projects that they do. Maybe they get a little bit of funding and they go. I think you said Uganda, is that right? And you do, some social projects and things like that. What do you say to the argument of just investing the money directly to the people of Uganda so that they can pursue their own opportunities. And you were talking before about the different types of dignity. And for me, the one that resonated for me the most was the communal one. And so
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it from that perspective as well. So what do you say to the argument of like, these things are great, fantastic, blah, 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 but why are we not just giving the money directly to these communities and allowing them to develop their own communal solutions to their own problems?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what they were doing.
Okay.
So the organizations were, local organizations that were building like, in solar energy or whatever it might
Mm-hmm.
be. And so it's really interesting because it's really interesting, this sort of mindset that can definitely creep in about other people knowing best. And even within that
Mm.
organization, you're selling solar products. There is, and this was back in 2015, 2016, when solar was just sort of taking off in a whole other way, in these environments. And there was an underlying assumption that people buy solar products because of, they want happy family and they want light so people can read at night. And, all of these sort of, these visuals of people at
I'm
home doing
remembering
their
all the
homework.
advertisements. Because in
Yeah.
Australia, if you remember, they had a scheme for it, and they were really trying to push people to get solar, and there were like government incentives and stuff, and it was similar. I recall similar advertisements of like really happy families, and it's like, did
Yes.
we just not have electricity before solar, or what happened here?
Well, I mean, and in these cases, that's the case. Like in
Yes,
Uganda,
in
there
Uganda,
wasn't
but
electricity
probably not
before.
in suburban
But
Melbourne.
yeah, exactly. But even in that case, I mean, my role was really like, I mean, they said I was like marketing and innovation director, but essentially I was trying to work out why people were buying their products.
Hmm.
And because they were quite successful and they had branches all over Uganda, like it wasn't a small outfit. Um and so this whole notion of happy family was kind of the value proposition that they assumed. But actually, there was this major segment of the market that was buying products because they wanted to build businesses. So micro entrepreneurship was really rampant in Uganda because unemployment's really high,
Mm.
and people have multiple income streams. Like that's how people operate. So they didn't want to just buy lights. They wanted to buy fridges so they could have cold drink business, or they wanted to get the TV version, or like one product that was like really hot at the time was hair clippers, like solar powered hair clippers so that they
Oh,
could,
really?
have a hairdressing business. So these
That's
were,
amazing.
really, so it just opened a whole new, line of thinking about, well, actually, we are kind of selling business in a box. We're not just selling light and happy families.
Mm.
We're selling a way for people to create their own micro businesses, and this sort of dignity of choice in that is really important. And actually, marketing to them as, happy family. Like obviously there are some people where that's true, but there was also a big market that was operating completely differently. And I think that this, I mean, we've sort of gone a bit of a tangent, but it's a type of technology. I think when we're talking about,
Tangents are welcome on this podcast, Loren.
but I think that
I
this
go on them all the
really,
time.
yeah, this really sort of talks strongly to the fact of how like our assumptions and biases can really impact what we think we're doing with a product without really
Mm.
engaging with the people involved. And when we've been trialing this dignity lens in different contexts, and like it's really awesome to say that, like, a 6-person data science team has like embedded it into their practices. Like this is how they're now doing their work, which is really cool. One of the things that comes up a lot is, well, by having this sort of conversation focused on dignity, we're constantly thinking about the people involved, which can be really forgotten, even with the best intentions.
Yeah.
And, what I sort of witnessed in that context is happening as we're building products all the time.
So then on this point of, assumptions and biases and different cultures, and when I think about this idea of dignity, and you gave the different types, the other thing I'm thinking about is the way dignity is perceived across different cultures.
Yeah.
And it's going to be perceived very differently. Like they might not all fit into the categories that you
Yes.
shared. And even
Yes.
if they do fit into the categories that you shared, maybe they fit in different ways. And we know that technology is predominantly, like, the big players are predominantly in the West. And so
Mm.
how do you grapple with trying to kind of, as you were saying, enhance dignity in technology, but in a way that caters to more than just the West? Which is, what we've seen
100%.
has been just, it's like the seesaw, it's completely unbalanced.
Yes. Well, there's sort of two prongs to your question, I think, in terms of, well, one, the dignity lens itself is grounded in a Western
Yeah.
viewpoint because that's where I am and that's where the organizations are. So there is a recognition that this is a live framing that is open to a plurality of perspectives. So I am quite careful and quite aware that the perspectives that we're dealing with at the moment are the ones that we've come across because of the types of environments we've been, and it has been very contextual in that way. However, if and hopefully when it's engaged with in different contexts, there is it's not a fixed framing to accommodate those other things. One thing that I have been quite conscious of doing, though, is engaging with non-Western viewpoints from the literature perspective to kind of get a sense of, well, how resonant are these words? And, there is pushback, to be completely honest, about the word dignity because, a lot of people have very strong connotations
Yeah.
of that word in itself, even if the underlying concepts might be similar to a different word in their culture. So there's definitely these things to navigate. The second part of your question was around, how to really deal with that when everyone's experiences are so different. And I think that this is one of the things that's really interesting and challenging about thinking about dignity as experience, because so often, I think this is kind of where your question was going a little bit, is, we're trying to standardize people into common groups to be able to automate and do things for the majority. And the dignity as experience part in particular really forces people to think about edge cases, like even just calling them edge cases, right, is already so undignified. Because, like they are
The
actual
irony.
humans. Yeah, the actual humans engaging with your system. And yeah, maybe they don't fit in like this middle bit of your curve, but that doesn't mean that they, shouldn't be catered for. And so there's been some really interesting conversations that come from really like living in the edges, um, to be to really like to not neglect and not just say, oh well, they're not the target mark, because there's a lot of, oh, it's an edge case, so
Yeah,
like,
so
and
we're
then
just going
like
to
that's
ignore
it,
it. But I think for
yeah.
me, the challenging part about that is, and maybe this is getting a little bit too philosophical. I don't know how much you delve into the more philosophical side of this argument. You probably get it a lot. But dignity to me is just a basic human, not even a right, it's just a basic human experience of dignity. And yes, it's perceived differently across different cultures, it's understood differently, it's, all of those things, but it's an across the board given. And so when we talk about them as edge cases, it's like, oh, it's across the board given for some people, not for others. And I think
Mm,
this is the fundamental issue I'm having with technology being predominantly a Western thing,
mm,
right? It's always about, we want to improve working conditions for some people. We
mm,
want to improve healthcare for some people. We want
yep,
to improve blah, blah, blah for some people. And so it's the same with this kind of thing, right? Like, obviously, you're trying to include these things in your research, but as one person and one researcher, there's only so much you can include. You're not going to include every single culture across the
yes,
world. And like, it's impossible for you to do so. And you have
mm,
to draw lines and you have to make the decision on where to draw them. And because
mm,
the predominant amount of the research is in the West, it's automatically going to skew you that way because that's where the literature is, that's where the information is, that's where you go. And if you're
mm,
not of a particular culture as well, it's even hard to penetrate when you're talking about things like dignity, which is a very, very personal cultural experience. So, like, for
mm,
example, my family's Middle Eastern, and dignity in a Middle Eastern culture is very strongly tied to like personal self respect.
mhm,
There's a lot of like stoicism kind of tied to it. Whereas,
mhm,
you were talking before about the communal one, and that one actually resonated with me way more, But, for
Yes.
someone like my dad who was born in Lebanon and didn't migrate to Australia until he was in his 20s, if you ask him what dignity means, he's going to give you a definition that is much more around the, like how you respect yourself as a person and how you carry yourself and those kinds of things.
Yes, 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 yes. So that's a really good point, and there are lots of other, this sort of idea of dignity as virtue, dignity
Mm,
as these sorts of ideas are really also very very prevalent, um, and to some extent, some of that is captured in dignity of choice, but it is a bit different. Like there's also, dignity associated with rank or status. So like being a
yeah.
dignitary, for example, like there's a lot there's a lot in it. Um,
I'm only one
and
person and one researcher.
well, no, but I suppose and like your challenge is a good one, in that, you can't cover everything. I think
You'll be
one of the
employed for the
things,
rest of your life, Loren, if someone's willing to employ you on this topic.
well, hopefully they listen to this podcast and
You can use
uh
this as part of your application when you're applying for a job. This is why you will always have to employ me.
Yeah, I think that one thing that does, so I think that there is a danger in kind of positioning frameworks as the sort of be all and end all, no, like
Mm,
place of knowing, and then other people kind of coming into that to kind of, checklist themselves against this frame. Like the goal of the framework is not so much to be a checklist that, from a design perspective, that is quite clear, because one of the things that we're trying to move beyond is sort of a checklist culture of thinking about responsibility. And so it's much more positioned as a reflective practice tool. And in that sense, and so the importance of reflective practice for responsible behavior, in practice, like not just saying the things, but doing the things, and it, in the micro decision making of every day, is really important. And I think that that is where, well, I hope, and the aspiration is that the dignity lens, has quite a lot of humility built into it. Is like, here's some different ways. Um, let's think about those ways in your context, and also bring other ones into the conversation. So it's not, some people then see that as, a lack of rigor, because, it's like, well, it's not set down. So how are you going to do the compare and contrast across things and whatever else? That's not really the goal. Like, I'm not trying to do some comparative analysis of, these organizations like communal dignity and these ones, I'm not betting it down from that perspective. It's still very exploratory. It's not locked down. I would contend that locking it down would do it a disservice,
I agree
in the
entirely.
sense that it is a reflective practice tool um for people to challenge, yes, we care about dignity, but it doesn't look like any of these things that you're talking about. This is what it looks like for us. Or equally, like the more common one actually is dignity. Like, what's that got to do with anything that we're doing here? And so it's actually
We just want to
it's
fly
actually
this
the
drone.
reverse. Yeah. And it's so fascinating. Yeah. Once you get into the conversation, they're like, oh, okay. Like actually that's fundamental to all of the things that we're doing, but we would never really have framed it in that way. And so there
Mm,
is a language issue, but there's also some benefits in having like a specific language to
yeah.
give it names. And actually, some of Donna Hicks's work is all about like the naming of it in organizational culture. Like she's now moved into more leadership and organizational culture sorts of things, and dignity in the workplace. And just having a map of words so people can actually identify with it, identify what it is, and create a language is a big part of the process.
When I worked in industry and I worked in government, we used to do all of these kind of things. They weren't referred to as dignity. They were referred to as, like organizational values and all of that kind of stuff. And
Yes.
we were all
Yes.
required to do it. And it very much felt like a performative checkbox
Yes.
activity, right? Like it
Yes.
was like, we would have the morning tea and they'd have the values on the wall and they'd be like, we all respect each other. And then you go back to your desk and there's this passive aggressive email from your manager and you're like, okay.
Mm,
So
mm, mm.
it's
Yeah.
it's one of those things. And you said before that this is specifically not a checkbox thing. So how
Yes.
do you take something that is like a framework, which is traditionally like a checkbox activity? How do you take
Mm,
that and make it into something that's not a checkbox activity and that
mm.
people are going to receive? in the right way.
One important part of my research is that I'm only working with organizations who are already committed to responsibility practices. I'm not trying to convince them. And I think that this is really important, because I think if you are trying to convince the leadership or the whoever, that's a different question.
Yeah.
And that arguably more difficult question to change people's mindsets. So the organizations that I'm working with they're not the mainstream this is not a state of play type of organization. These are the organizations that are really proactive, like, are finding me, like they have come to me in different ways because they want to be responsible. They think there's something valuable in thinking with dignity, and that's connected to their organizational values, for example. So that's a really important distinction. And I think, coming back to your point, one of the things that I have found super helpful in the last year or so is framing this a lot in what we might call prospective theorizing. So I'm not trying to like look at the past and see, okay, here's all the things that people are doing on average generally in the world to be responsible. That is a type of research that I'm not really doing. What the research I'm doing is like, here's this small utopian group of people that, could represent a future that we would like to occur. Let's dive deeply with those groups to understand and to demonstrate how this is possible to propel a future that we want to see. And that's a very different type of research.
It
Like,
is.
that's, more and there's words around it. I've recently found out about prospective theorizing. And so you're
I
trying to,
love that word.
it's great. And like, there's
Yeah.
people doing it. Speculative rigor is a thing. And, there's ways to really use these things as a way to shape the future. And I think that this is, a fascinating area of how academia can contribute to having impact. It's not just, it's important to look backwards and to really have a view of what's happened. And also to potentially, dive into these pockets of places which have a desirable future that we want to see emulated, to try and make that more visible. So I definitely see myself in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But then so I'll say that first, because part of your question about, say one thing and do another, there's a few nuances with the organizations. They're small organizations. So there's sort of less of this, giant corporate values and then, 500 people down,
I
so
know.
that's definitely an important nuance as well. But I think that even in a small organization, even when you do have a clear remit, commitment to, and not just organizationally, also personally, to being responsible, it's still really hard to do. Like, it's really hard to, and there's a big fear in these organizations that they are going to fall victim, or they are going to be perceived as ethics washing or responsibility washing, whatever
Yeah.
term you want to use, right? So on a practical level, it's really interesting, because the organization who's embedded this, one of their core goals was, we want to build our responsibility intuition. That was how they framed it. Our responsibility muscles through, engaging with this framework. So the point is not to check boxes, but to convene conversations. So practically, this meant that it was integrated into their Jira tickets. It was integrated into how they did wikis. There were checkpoints at different points in time. But one of the main things that it did was there was like a force function to, if your intuition, to tap, like, your intuition is valued here. If you're coding some algorithm and you think, I'm about to assume something, or I'm about to hard code something that may have an implication later down, there's a tendency to be like, oh, we'll just deal with that later. No, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you're having that moment, you have permission to have a moment to think about that. And if you can't get to the bottom of a reason that you then document, you have permission to raise it in this particular forum, and to use this dignity lens as an excuse or a reason to have that conversation. And so this idea of tapping into an intuition, of valuing an intuition, is really quite at odds with, a build fast, break fast sort of culture, which a lot of people have come from, even if your organizational values say something.
Yeah.
And
Just
so
on a quick
that looks
side
very
note, if
different.
you were ever going to turn this into a small business, have a moment. Fantastic business name.
Have a moment.
Have a
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. And so it is about these micro moments like that. That's a big part of this is, you know, a small decision that you make now in a prototype that no one really cares about because, you know, all these things about, well, it's just a prototype. But the problem is that often what happens is these prototypes are successful and then they become the blueprint for the bigger thing and the bigger thing and the bigger thing and the bigger
We've
thing.
lost longevity of thought.
Yeah. And,
We
you know,
have.
this thing that seems really inconsequential that was hard coded now has been scaled and
Mhm.
that person had an inkling, probably. If, you know,
And
and so this is all about fostering that.
this is me getting into my little engineering gripe, but proper systems engineering practices are supposed to cater to this moment that we're supposed to have,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
And we're missing a lot of those. So for those listeners who don't know, so systems engineering practice is basically like you want to build something, you've got to go through a process. You have to design it, you have to do some testing on that design, you then build a prototype, you do some testing, blah, 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 blah. And traditionally this took a long time for things to get from the point of design through to the point of, you know, actually being out in the world and in the wild. But with software enabled tools, so things like, you know, ChatGPT and social media and all that kind of stuff, it's a fraction of the time frame for a lot of reasons, one of them being that there is no physical hardware attached to it. So yes, you need your phone to
Mm.
access them, but the person who's developing ChatGPT or the person who's developing Instagram doesn't also have to develop the phone. They're just
Mm.
developing this ubiquitous software tool that is, you know, it's not tangible. And so the
Yes.
reason this cut down the time is because with a physical thing like a bridge or a building or a car, when something goes wrong, it is usually catastrophic. So, you know, if
Hmm.
a bridge collapses, people die. If a building collapses, people die. If a car crashes, someone will get injured or someone dies. And so, because of that, you are required to be rigorous, whether it's your choice or not,
Yes.
because the repercussions of something going wrong will impact you in a severe way.
Yes.
Now you have these software enabled tools that don't have these physical liabilities that are attached to them.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
stuff can go wrong, but they're not going to go wrong in the same way that they go when you have this physical part.
Yes.
And I think that
Yes.
that's also part of what's taken away our moments as well, right? We used to have a pause for thought around like, I wonder if, you know, I don't add this extra bolt if this building's going to come down. You would have that pause for thought because the consequence was a bunch of people dying. But we
Mm.
no longer have that anymore because we've lost that direct link to a catastrophic event.
Yes. I think that's a really great point, and I think it connects to another point around we've also become culturally very accustomed to responsibility being equated with liability, and that
It's
is
a
the
good point.
main way we think about
Yeah.
responsibility. And, you know, those two things are connected, right? Because, you know, if it's a physical bridge, there's people dying and there's liability,
Yeah.
accountability, blame, and it's very clear. And so one of the other kind of threads of my research has been about really interrogating like what we mean by responsibility. And we're so focused on responsibility as liability,
Hmm.
accountability, like backward looking styles of responsibility, which really lend themselves towards checklists, right? Like if that's your view of
Yeah.
responsibility, then the way to, you know, combat that is to make sure that you're covered, that you can, you know, give an account, that you checked all those boxes. And so it's fueling this, you know, all the audits and impact assessments and the accountability structures, which we need. I'm not saying that they're not important.
Yeah,
What
but
I
we
am
don't
saying
just
though,
need them, right? Like we need other
yeah,
things
exactly.
attached to them.
So what I am saying is that yes, responsibility does look like that, and it can look at there can be other types of responsibility that are really important. And so some of those types of responsibility are responsibility, coming back to the other point, responsibility is virtue.
Hmm.
So narrative responsibility is also a really important one. So, you know, how you think about the story that you want to be able to meaningfully tell about yourself, about your organization, about the impact you're making on the world. Um, and so with the virtue one, it's much more about an internal compass. It's not someone externally is going to give you a lawsuit. It's more, that's not sitting well with me. That's going to keep me up at night. You know,
Hmm.
that type of internal driver, as opposed to an external one. And one that I really love is this idea of responsibility as power. That because you have a particular platform, there is a responsibility, again, an internal drive, whether that to be to future generations or, to, you know, to whoever you like,
Hmm.
that, you know, you have a position of power to use. And I think when we're talking about developing AI, there is such a position of power that is
Yeah.
incumbent on people building and deploying these systems. So it is much more about self-accountability because, the bridge isn't going to fall down and directly kill someone, but it might really impact their lives in a negative way that, you never find out about if you don't want to. And so there's this really interesting feedback loop of, ignorance is bliss, but am I going to be able to sleep better at night? And how do I sort of justify to myself, to my organization, to our stakeholders that we are acting responsibly? And this isn't just about checklists or legal public affairs departments. It's actually about the micro decision making, the culture, and the
Hmm.
values and how they
For
get played
sure.
out in practice.
And also, while the repercussions of, the building collapsing or the bridge collapsing are direct, like somebody gets injured or dies, you see it directly. The
Yes.
risks that come with, a lack of privacy on your data and things like that, those compound over time.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, I
Yes,
may not be physically harmed, but the definition of harm is not just physical. The
that's right.
definition of harm is much broader than that. And so just because I'm physically okay, that doesn't mean that you have not harmed me through this tool
Yes.
that you've developed. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that the idea of harm is well beyond physical harm. And when you're taking my information without my consent and you're using it in a way that I am not okay with, we're seeing a lot of these companies signing contracts with military organizations. And so Google's a great example. I use Google for lots of things. So you're telling me that all of my data and my information is now going to be used in a way that I'm not comfortable with, and I don't get a choice to consent to it. And so that's
Yes.
like a compounding risk that, sure, I'm physically not going to be harmed because I'm not in a country where I will be impacted by the kinds of tools that you're developing, but maybe it's going to impact me in a different way, and it's going to impact
Mm.
other people physically in a way that I'm not comfortable with.
Yes. And I think that brings up a really important point about, how we think about impacts.
Mm-hmm.
And, and timeframes is a really important one. Directness and indirectness is a really important one. Like there are lots of different dimensions to what an impact actually is. And, at the moment, of course we're going to look at linear impacts because that's the most obvious and even that's difficult to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's like all these ripple effect impacts or impacts over different timeframes or impacts in different, particularly indirect impacts that are difficult to deal with and also make up a really large, if you were, going to look at
Yeah.
the impact and over time frames as well is a really big one, as you're
It
talking
is.
about.
This is probably a wonderful segue into the last question, which is a question that I ask all of my guests. And it is, what is one piece of advice you could give people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible byte?
My one responsible but well, you kind of pulled it out of what I was saying before, which is take a moment. I really
Ta-da!
love that. Yeah, have a moment. And whether that
Trademark
means
for Loren Ruster 2025.
I'll be like infinitely. But I really do believe the power of reflective practice. And whether that means as a user of a product to take that moment, whether that means as a designer or a coder or a developer or a person who's governing, how can you build those reflective practice moments into what you're doing to really, think beyond the sort of fast brain mode and into a slower brain, a more, longitudinal brain, having those moments and valuing them in your organizational culture can really shift what responsibility looks like in the day to day.
I think that's such a positive way to end this episode. Loren, you have been so amazing to talk to. I feel like I have a way better understanding of dignity now, and I'm on board. I'm on board with dignity and technology and the frameworks.
Oh, good.
Not that I wasn't before. I just want to put that out there. It's just that I didn't really understand how you were trying to capture dignity in technology. But honestly, this has been so wonderful to talk to you, and it's been fantastic. Thank you, Loren.
Great. Thanks so much, Zena. It's been a pleasure.